In 1995, the future of video games looked obvious. Put games on CDs, render everything in 3D, aim the advertising at teenagers, and watch the money pour in. Sony had turned that formula into the PlayStation, so rival companies rushed to copy what they could see. But they copied the CDs, the polygons, and the gray plastic. They missed the invisible part that actually made the PlayStation work. The result was a graveyard of strange machines, broken promises, and 3D games that looked less like the future and more like a nightmare assembled from triangles. One company burned through hundreds of millions of dollars. Another sold fewer than 50,000 consoles. But the strangest failure came from Apple, and its story reveals why almost everyone misunderstood Sony. The panic had started before the PlayStation even reached American stores. Throughout the early 1990s, companies believed compact discs would transform gaming. A cartridge might hold a few megabytes, but a CD-ROM could store roughly 650 megabytes. That sounded revolutionary, so executives imagined longer games, cinematic stories, orchestral music, and realistic worlds. But storage was not the same thing as power. Philips discovered that distinction with the CDI. Originally positioned as an interactive multimedia machine rather than a conventional console, it launched at around $700 in the United States. It could play educational programs, reference discs, movies with extra hardware, and games. In theory, that made it more useful than a Super Nintendo. In practice, customers saw an expensive black box with slow menus and software that often felt like a museum kiosk. Philips even gained access to Nintendo characters because of a failed CD partnership between Nintendo and Sony. That produced games such as Hotel Mario and 3 infamous Zelda titles. But recognizable names could not rescue stiff controls, bizarre animation, and hardware never designed to compete in fast arcade-style gaming. Philips reportedly sold about 1 million CDI units across several years, but the project cost the company heavily. The lesson should have been clear: multimedia features did not create a game platform. But the industry focused on the disc, so the same mistake kept returning in new forms. Panasonic's 3DO looked much closer to the coming revolution. Designed by a company founded by Electronic Arts veteran Trip Hawkins, the 3DO was built around an unusual licensing model. The 3DO company would create the standard, electronics manufacturers would build the machines, and software publishers would support a shared platform. It sounded like the VHS model for gaming, but console makers usually sold hardware cheaply and recovered the loss through software royalties. Panasonic had no such safety net, so its first 3DO system launched in 1993 for $699. That was more than twice the later American launch price of the PlayStation. The 3DO had some impressive games. Need for Speed began there. Road Rash gained full-motion video, licensed music, and dramatically upgraded visuals. But the machine also became a magnet for grainy interactive movies because publishers confused CD capacity with meaningful design. Customers were being asked to pay luxury prices for technology that already felt uncertain. So when Sony launched the PlayStation in North America at $299, the 3DO's argument collapsed. It was not enough to be powerful. A console had to be affordable, easy to understand, and surrounded by games people actually wanted. Atari made the opposite promise. Its Jaguar arrived with a price of $249, and the slogan, "Do the math," aggressively advertising itself as the first 64-bit system. But its architecture used multiple processors that were notoriously difficult to coordinate. Developers faced confusing tools, tight schedules, and a tiny customer base. So many games barely used the machine's potential. Alien vs. Predator showed what the Jaguar could do, but titles like Club Drive exposed the other reality: flat landscapes, sparse objects, unstable movement, and worlds that felt unfinished. Atari added a CD attachment in 1995, creating the famous stack of hardware that players later joked resembled a toilet. Only 11 Jaguar CD games were released during its commercial life, and estimates suggest fewer than 20,000 attachments were sold. The Jaguar was marketed as more advanced than its rivals, but numbers on a box meant little when developers could not turn them into games. Sony understood that third-party studios needed practical tools. Atari demanded that customers do the math, but customers did something simpler. They looked at the software shelves. Sega should have been Sony's most dangerous opponent. The Genesis had made Sega a genuine American powerhouse, and the Saturn was capable of spectacular 2D graphics. But the market had suddenly decided that polygons represented progress, so Sega pushed the Saturn as a 3D machine even though its complicated dual-processor design made 3D development difficult. The American launch became a disaster. At E3 in May 1995, Sega announced that the Saturn was not coming in September as expected. It was already available, 4 months early, for $399. Certain retailers had not been warned, developers lost preparation time, and the launch selection was painfully small. Sony executive Steve Race followed with one of the shortest speeches in gaming history. That single number turned Sega's surprise into an ambush against itself. The Saturn eventually gained excellent games, especially in Japan, but its identity had fractured. Sega had supported the Genesis, Sega CD, 32X, Game Gear, and Saturn within a short period, so customers no longer knew which promise to trust. The 32X was especially damaging. Released in late 1994 for $159, it transformed the Genesis into a more powerful system, but the Saturn was already approaching. Only about 40 games reached the 32X, and many owners realized they had purchased a bridge to nowhere. But not every failure came from chasing realistic 3D. NEC's PCFX failed because it resisted the trend almost completely. NEC had enjoyed major success in Japan with the PC Engine, known as the TurboGrafx 16 in North America. Its successor, the PCFX, launched in Japan in December 1994. The machine looked like a small desktop computer and specialized in anime-style full-motion video and 2D graphics. But it lacked dedicated hardware for the kind of textured polygons becoming central to the PlayStation and Saturn. NEC was betting that Japanese players would continue valuing animated adventures and familiar 2D design. But the PlayStation made 3D feel culturally unavoidable. Even crude polygons signaled that a game belonged to tomorrow. The PCFX sold roughly 400,000 units and never launched outside Japan. That failure reveals something important. Sony was not merely selling better graphics, it was selling a direction. Competing machines either chased that direction badly or refused to chase it at all. Nintendo tried to create an entirely different future with the Virtual Boy. Released in 1995, it promised stereoscopic 3D through a tabletop visor. But the display used only red LEDs, the unit was not truly portable, and players had to press their faces against a rigid stand. After a few minutes, the dark room, glowing red image, and awkward posture could make the future feel surprisingly uncomfortable. Nintendo priced it at $179 in the United States, but only 22 games were released worldwide. Sales reached roughly 770,000 units before the system disappeared. This was not a weak company losing to Sony. This was Nintendo, the dominant name in games, discovering that novelty without comfort could become a punishment. Still, the most revealing PlayStation-era flop came from outside the traditional console business. In 1996, Apple technology powered a game machine called the Pippin. Bandai manufactured the best-known version, the Atmark in Japan and the At-World in the United States. It was based on Macintosh architecture, used CDs, connected to televisions, and offered internet-related features. In other words, it attempted to merge a computer, a multimedia device, and a console. That sounds strangely modern. But the American price was $599. The hardware was underpowered compared with dedicated game systems, and the software library was tiny. Estimates commonly placed total sales at around 42,000 units. Apple had supplied a platform, Bandai had supplied consumer hardware, and the machine offered more functions than a PlayStation. But none of those functions gave people a compelling reason to choose it. The Pippin copied the visible shape of the multimedia future while repeating the CDI's oldest mistake, assuming that versatility creates desire. And that is the hidden reason Sony won. The PlayStation was not simply a CD player with 3D graphics. Sony made development relatively accessible, charged a competitive price, pursued third-party publishers, marketed games as entertainment for older teenagers and adults, and built a recognizable identity around the software. Developers gained an audience, so more developers arrived. More games attracted more players, so the audience grew. The advantage compounded. Its rivals treated hardware as the product. Sony treated the entire ecosystem as the product. At the end of the decade, the original PlayStation would sell more than 102 million units. The CDI, 3DO, Jaguar, PCFX, Virtual Boy, and Pippin became curiosities, but they were not pointless machines. Each contained one fragment of the future: discs, digital video, online connectivity, stereoscopic displays, or computer-like flexibility. They failed because a fragment was presented as the whole answer. That is what makes these forgotten consoles feel almost tragic. They were not always looking backward. Sometimes they were looking so far ahead that they forgot to give people a reason to follow. Which failed 1990s system would you bring back for one more chance? Share your choice, and stay with us for more stories from gaming's strangest forgotten corners.